relationship has developed. We've just, been teaching each other key phrases in our own language, and it's gone on from there. Now that's remarkable, don't you think? And actually, it represents a huge challenge for educators everywhere in the world. Because my son has learnt to speak a very complex language inside a year without a textbook, without a teacher, and without a school. Why? Because he wanted to. How? With somebody who was truly an expert who lives in the culture he was trying to attain. This is a challenge. And this represents a massive challenge for us as educators. Because if education is to remain credible, we have to understand that not changing is simply not an option. We have to move. And we have to move quickly. Otherwise, our customers are going to get to a point one day where they will actually question why they need to come to us at all. But more importantly than that, the most important lesson and the question I was asking, going back to what I said about Dave Brailsford and British cycling, is he still possesses that ability to absorb and take on new information and new skills, almost as a biological process. Change is something that's a constant in a young person's life. And the irony is, the younger we are, the more we want change. For those of us that have had kids, you think about your children pre-3 years of age. You think about how demanding they are. They're not demanding because they want to do the same thing day after day, hour after hour. They're not turning round to you when they're 2 saying, just tell me what my routines are and don't make me change anything, ever. Because this is what I do, bath time is at 5 o'clock. Right? This is not what happens. You don't meet many 2-year-old children who are in therapy because they can't cope with the rate of change in their lives. In fact, if you make them do the same thing for more than 10 minutes, there will be a revolution in your household. It's no accident that experts will tell us that we learn somewhere between 70 and 75% of everything we learn in our lifetime before we're 5 years old. Now, I'm not talking about knowledge. I'm not talking about the accumulation of experiences and information. But you think about the complexity of what we achieve in the first 5 years of our lives. We learn to walk and talk. We learn to understand vocal intonation, facial expression, body language. We learn to be able to make sense of the physical world around us, sight, smell, sound, touch. All of those things happen before we're 5. We are remarkable. And then something happens to us, a tipping point, where we kind of go from a curve of learning that looks like this. And as we get older, it tips and becomes flatter. We may kid ourselves and believe that the pinnacle of learning happens between 16 and 18 because that's the top end of school education, or between 18 and 21 because that's when most people go to university. What's actually happening on that journey is this, which is a really interesting thought, don't you think? And then you get to adulthood, and you get to be a gold medal winning Olympian, one of the greatest practitioners in your field on earth. And you find yourself in a climate where most of the top athletes I spend time with find change something that is deeply uncomfortable. You think about our own lives as adults. We tend to lock down increasingly so much of the factors and variables in which we live. We start going to the same restaurants because we know we like them. We won't order food we don't understand. We only read books by authors we like. We only go to the cinema to see films that we think we'll like. Everything about our lives become locked down. We go to holiday resorts because we know we like them. We only make friends with our kind of people. We lock our lives down. And the older we become, the more locked down our lives become. And here's the really interesting question. I love this picture. I love this picture, and I'm not going to ask you for a physical answer, but just work it out in your heads. It's not a trick question. How old do you think the person is that drew that picture? Not over 50, right? Not over 40. Not over 30 or 20 or 10. Probably not over 5. And you'd be right. So here's a question to think about for all of us as students and as teachers and as parents. Who was the first person who taught you that you had to colour in between the lines? Because that's the tipping point. That's the moment at which it all begins to change. You see, what happens subtly at that point in our lives is up until that moment, we believe we are in control of learning, our own curiosity, the things that we're interested in. We dive into stuff because it fascinates us. We just immerse ourselves in the possibility of what we could do, where we could be, what could happen. And then what happens is somebody comes along and says, actually, none of that's important. What's important is what I tell you is important. What's important is that you do what I tell you to do in the way I tell you to do it. So contentiously, what starts to happen is we start to prepare children for a world of certainty. Now, to an extent, although change has always been part of human existence, to an extent, in an industrial age, teaching young people to look for certainty was the right thing to do. Get to university, get yourself a degree, get yourself a job that will certainly give you a career for the rest of your life, that will give you choice, that will allow you to buy a house wherever you want to buy a house, will allow you to begin a family in whatever way you want to begin a family. Certainty, seek out certainty. That's what we were taught to do. What, of course, we know is that certainty doesn't exist. But what it's left us with is a really interesting legacy. And the way I want to explain that legacy to you, and I'm going to be telling you stories in the time I have this morning about people that have just helped me reframe the way I think. And I hope by sharing them with you, they'll do the same thing. Also, some of them are quite famous. And I make no apology for the fact that by telling you about my famous friends, I'm hoping that you'll suddenly think I'm more terrific than I really am, okay? That's really important to me. So I will be name-dropping in the next half an hour or so. The first person I want to tell you about is this guy. Now, I can see from your faces that none of you have any idea. But he is actually quite famous. The interesting thing is, when I tell you his name, most of you still won't know who I'm talking about. This is Sébastien Foucan. Now, Sébastien is the founder of parkour, or free running. Now people are going, oh yes, yeah, okay. Now, Seb is famous for a number of things, but let me tell you about two of my favourite of his accomplishments. How many of you saw the Daniel Craig James Bond film, Casino Royale? Did you see that film? Do you remember the opening sequence where Bond is chasing a bad guy over buildings and cranes and leaping from, right? That is Sébastien. Now, a couple of things to know for those of you that remember that sequence. The first is there was no safety equipment used in that sequence. Took 2.5 weeks to plan, but there was no safety equipment. Now, here's the really interesting thing. When you understand, even if you didn't see the sequence, right? Free running parkour, it's the leaping over buildings and all that malarkey. Seb is scared of heights. Genuinely, honestly, that's true, right? The second thing he's very cool and groovy and famous for is he choreographed Madonna's last world tour. Right? This is a really good guy. And I find, as a balding, fat, middle-aged man, hanging out with young, cool people is a really good thing to do. It just makes me feel younger and alive. So I hang out with Seb. And I thought, this is what really upset me, right? I'm in my late 40s, and I thought Seb was way younger than me. Because if you look on any of the show reels and he looks like ripped and cool. He's 42 years old, right? That really hurt. So, Seb and I were walking through the streets of Ekaterinburg together in Russia. Now again, it's a city some of you may not know, but it's infamous because it's the city in Russia where the Tsar and Tsarina and their children were slaughtered at the end of the Russian Revolution. And it's a remarkable city because it's a city where the architecture tells the history of the place. So you have pre-communist buildings, beautiful, opulent, grand buildings. Then you have the very communist, stark, concrete, functional buildings. And now what you're seeing is an explosion in modern architecture, in self-expression, in magnificence and creativity. And as I'm walking through the streets with Seb, I'm looking at these buildings like a child at a firework display, saying, look, wow. Right? Seb has said nothing. We get to the end of our journey, which is the building which represents the place where the Tsar and Tsarina and their family were slaughtered, which is called the Church of the Blood. Now, for a boy who's a man but actually has a boy's brain, that was like too exciting. Anything called the Church of the Blood for me is just terrific, right? So we arrive at this place and I turn to Sebastian and I say, hasn't this walk, aren't the buildings amazing? And he said to me, I have no idea what you're talking about. I said, the buildings, they're fantastic, look. He said, I haven't seen them. And I'm looking at Sebastian thinking, what? He said, no, really. He said, it's not a good thing or a bad thing. He said, I can't tell you why. He said, but since I was a child, I guess I look at the world differently from most people. He said, in an urban environment, you're looking at the buildings. He said, buildings have never interested me. Because to me, buildings block out the light. He said, I've always been fascinated by the spaces between buildings. He said, have you ever noticed how beautiful the spaces between buildings are? He said, they are truly extraordinary. He said, and when I was walking with you through the city just now, what was going through my head was, how do I get round them? How do I get over them? How do I use the spaces to cut through these obstacles? And as he was talking, I was thinking to myself, it's a very interesting metaphor. Because what we tend to do in traditional education is teach people to look at the problems. And as we get older, we tend to be, as human beings, people who will say things like, oh, that's a great idea, but we can't because this. Oh, I've always wanted to, but I never did because this. Of course, when I was young, I had dreams, and what I really wanted to be was this, but this got in the way. What we need, I believe, is an education system that stops teaching people about the objects and starts teaching people to explore the joy and wonder and possibility of the spaces around and between the objects. And that means we have to come back to this idea of self-leadership. And what that means is we have to stop seeking out silver bullets to find the answer. You see, one of the real problems with education over the last 30 or 40 years, because of the way we were educated, because of the way people think, and this isn't a criticism of educators, this is just the way we have been taught to think. We believe that the solution lies in somebody else, that somebody else will come along and tell us what to do and how to do it. And every few months or every